So now you know a little bit about the machines themselves. You could definitely make the argument that they started out with really good intentions, that they started out with the purpose of trying to help people, especially new immigrants to the country. But there's an old saying that says power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Problem was that the longer the machines were in power, the more power they accrued, the more money that came in, they started to become more and more corrupt. And it just continued to get worse and worse until it finally reached a point that the people, especially in the city, couldn't really stand it any further. It had been just accepted as this is the way things were supposed to be for so long that we finally just reached what's called a tipping point, and people were just fed up. Now, at the outset, remember what I said. Political machines provided city dwellers with vital services. Now, you got to keep in mind the world we live in today is different from the world of the late 1800s. Okay, you can think about all the different things that we take for granted today. And we've mentioned this before, things like sanitation and sewer systems and stuff like that. Well, back in this day and age, there really wasn't anything set up on a municipal or a citywide service for these things. For example, there was no what's called a social safety net. There was no unemployment insurance. There was no kind of real aid from the government. And so as a result, you had a number of people in a lot of these cities were not really doing well. They were lacking a number of necessities. I mentioned previously that you would have various political bosses would even go so far as to give out, shoes to make sure that people had shoes to wear. So there were a number of different services that the people in any one of these cities desperately needed. The machines were there to provide those services, and they did a good job at that. They did help them with things like work and food and housing and all of the above. But you've got to keep in mind this was not a government. At best, as I said, it could be thought of as a shadow government. So while they went through and they did provide all these services, that's how they started to gain more and more power. The more services they provided, the more people were willing to vote the way they were told. The more people voted the way they were told, the more power the machine had and the more things it could do. And it was like a snowball rolling downhill. It just continued to grow in scope and in abilities and in power. And as they gained that power, a great many bosses became corrupt. They started being more concerned with how much money they could get, how much power they could have, rather than looking at how could they help the people around them. Now, like I said, you could definitely make the argument that it started out with noble purposes of trying to help people with the necessities of life. But as time progressed, the bosses moved further and further away from helping people and got closer to the concept of helping themselves and getting the other people to basically just do what they were told. So power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely, is what we're seeing here. The more power the bosses got, the more corrupt they became. Now, they grew rich through something called graft. Now, graft is the illegal use of political influence for personal gain. Now, there is a book called Plunkett of Tammany Hall, which is actually about one of these political machines. And they had a chapter in there called Honest Graft versus Dishonest Graft. Another way to think about that would be honest thieving versus dishonest thieving. So a lot of the machines and the bosses themselves did not look at graft really as being anything illegal. They saw it simply as, I'm in this position to do this, therefore I should be rewarded with, fill in the blank. And so they went through and they were getting more and more power. They were getting more and more money through their political influence. And as that grew, it was a growing hunger. The more power they had, the more power they wanted. So what do? If you already are getting everybody just about to vote the way you want them to, you're going to have to try and get more people to vote. So the bosses would fill the voter rolls with the names of pretty much anyone. Children, pets, the dead. They would go through because this was a point in time where we didn't have any real ID. People would just show up to vote, give their name, vote, and that was it. So, like I said before about, taking the guy who had the full beard and then the goatee and then the mustache and then clean shaven to vote 4 times, same kind of thing is going on here. Now, we as a nation have had shenanigans in every political campaign that's ever existed. In 2012, you had Governor Mitt Romney running against President Obama. And in one particular precinct, I forget where it was, I believe it was, I want to say Philadelphia, but I'm not sure, you had Governor Romney received 100% of the vote. Every single person voted for him. Plus, 40% of the vote went for President Obama. Now, if you haven't already done the math, 100% plus 40% is 140%. So we've always had shenanigans. My favorite example of shenanigans was the 1960 presidential election at a small polling place in Texas. You had 300 people show up with 1 minute before the polls closed. All 300 showed up at the exact same time, and they also happened to show up in alphabetical order. So, I mean, it was the most amazing coincidence ever. It would be like if we had class going on and everybody got up to go to lunch and all the student body arrived in line at the same time, and somehow they miraculously all lined up in alphabetical order without trying. We've had shenanigans before. But in this case, these were getting really bad. Like I said, kids, pets, dead people, all of the above were now voting the way the machine wanted them to. And since the machine had such power within the city government, nothing was really ever investigated or questioned. It was just accepted that that was the way things were. Now, another illegal practice was called the kickback. Okay, this is kind of tied in with graft as well. Okay, now a kickback was when you had some kind of construction project. Let's say the city needs to build a new courthouse or something like that. Okay, and so what happens is the machine picks who's going to be the one actually doing the job. They pick the construction company. Well, the construction company charges 2 or 3 times whatever the price was. Okay, they would charge a higher price. And then that extra money that, was just, bonus, well, a big chunk of that got kicked back to the boss. So again, you have the boss is really running the city. He is making the decisions as to what various projects are going to be started, who's going to get to those projects, how much they're going to pay, and he's getting a chunk of the money just going right into his own pocket. And while it may have been a boss that started off with legitimate good intentions of trying to help people, the further they went down the rabbit hole and had more money in their pocket and more power at their command, the more likely they were to completely blow off and ignore the issues and the problems which were facing the people of their city. Now, one of the most powerful bosses is a guy that I mentioned previously. Okay, his name was William Marcy Tweed, or he was better known simply as Boss Tweed. Okay, now Boss Tweed was a New York Democratic politician, and he played this to the hilt. He really, when you think political machines and corrupt political bosses, what you need to think of is Boss Tweed. Okay, he was the head of Tammany Hall. Now, I mentioned Tammany Hall a moment ago. Okay, Tammany Hall was in that book, Plunkett of Tammany Hall, where they talked about honest graft versus dishonest graft. Well, Tammany Hall is the most powerful Democratic political machine in New York City. So you think about it. Even back at this point in time, New York is still the major city. And as a result, a political machine running a city of that size had tremendous, phenomenal power. And Boss Tweed was one to use that power. Now, again, as I've said numerous times now, perhaps he started everything off with the best of intentions. Perhaps he started everything off with, evil intentions. It's hard to say. But in this case, Boss Tweed had gone through and he had built up his machine to the point that you had something referred to as the Tweed Ring. Okay? And the Tweed Ring was a group of corrupt politicians led by Boss Tweed. Remember, if you are the boss of a political machine, that means you control thousands upon thousands of votes. You can decide elections just by telling people how they're supposed to vote that day. So you had politicians who felt that they owed their political existence to Boss Tweed, that they needed to, basically pay him back for his having gotten them elected. So you're going to see this collection of politicians basically willing to do whatever Boss Tweed tells them to. It's no longer about what is best for the people. It's no longer about representing the people or anything like that. It's now what's best for the party. Or I'm sorry, what's best for the machine. And whatever the boss says is best for the machine is what's best for the machine. So whatever Boss Tweed says is essentially going to be the law. Whatever he tells them to do, they're going to do. It's the epitome of essentially, he says jump and they ask how high. Now, into this, you get a political cartoonist. Now, most of us at one time or another have read a political cartoon. Some of us even enjoy them. But in this case, you've got one political cartoonist who takes exception to Boss Tweed and all the stuff he's doing, and he starts to make fun of him. The guy's name was Thomas Nast. Now, Thomas Nast was a political cartoonist, and in the newspapers of the day, he used to go through and make fun of Boss Tweed. Now, many of us do not like to be made fun of, and Boss Tweed is no exception to that rule. Boss Tweed did not like being made fun of. But what really bugged him was the fact that he was being made fun of in a cartoon. And you think about it, it wasn't the fact that it was just a cartoon. His comment at one point was that he didn't really care what a newspaper wrote about him. Because as he put it, the people that he was telling how to vote and whatnot, the people who were following the machine, he said it doesn't matter. They can't read. But they can, look at a picture and get it. And so he didn't like the fact that Thomas Nast was actually going through and was chipping away at the power base he had by pointing out all the various things that were happening. And it wasn't one of those things that happened, immediately. It wasn't something that just, changed overnight. But as time went on, as the various things that Boss Tweed was doing came to light, as Thomas Nast continued to draw his political cartoons, the public eventually became outraged by Tweed's practices. They hated the concept that he essentially owned politicians. They hated the idea that this individual, who was not elected by anyone and who was responsible to no one, had such power over their lives. And they started to demand something better. And so, after all of this, you end up with the Tweed ring being broken up in 1871. Boss Tweed and a number of his followers and the politicians that he owned, the people who were in his pocket and under his control, quite a few of them ended up going to prison. A big chunk of this credit has to go to Thomas Nast. The fact that you had political cartoons, that this was able to convince people who couldn't read to tell them the story of what was happening. Now, the sad thing is that, yes, the Tweed ring was broken up. Boss Tweed went to prison, but it didn't really matter. Shortly thereafter, another machine took its place. This one was headed by a guy named, one of these great names, Roscoe P. Conklin. And this time, the group was known as the Stalwarts, and they were Republicans. So you do see a change. You do see differences starting to creep in. You do see reform starting to make its way through the system. But it's going to take a while. Boss Tweed went to prison. Many of his followers went to prison. But it didn't end the machines. All it did was change who was boss.